is Alexandra. I'm a host of this session for IGF. I want to inform you that this session is recorded and hosted under the IGF Code of Conduct and UN Rules and Regulation. And the chat feature is for social chat only, and only the Q&A feature is used to ask questions.
Thank you, Alexandra. Quick question. The webinar is recorded. Where will it be possible to get the recording of the webinar afterward?
I think one day we wait for this.
I suppose that would be on the IGF website.
Yes.
Same for the presentations of the speakers?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Well, let's start, I think, so that we're on time to open the timer. So let me introduce the webinar. Welcome all, welcome the speakers and the attendees. So I'll start with the introduction of the topic of the webinar and the speakers, and then I give the floor. So I'm Kian Kasugari, and I work at the World Trade Organizations, and I'm with my colleagues Agatha and Lee, who have helped me to organize these webinars. So in terms of the topic at hand, international trade is facilitated when internet functions at its best and data can flow freely and efficiently. And by the same token, the global reach and effectiveness of the internet depend on international trade to a large extent. And that's why in this session, we would like to show evidence that international trade governance contributes to the smooth and effective functioning of the internet, and therefore should be part of the internet governance discussions here at the IGF. In addition to that, we would like to show evidence that data governance is key for international trade growth as well, and that the trade policy community can also learn from the different policy communities that regulate data. So for this webinar, we have 4 speakers with us today with different backgrounds. I'm sharing my screen to present you the speakers. Share. Please let me know if you can see the PowerPoint. I suppose not.
Yes, we can see.
Oh, wonderful. So first, we'll have Carl Grandberg, a senior policy advisor at Internet Society. We have also Jade Nester, who is the director at the GSMA Consumer Policy Unit. Richard Sayers is a principal policy officer at the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom, but is also representing the Global Privacy Assembly today, which is an international association of data protection authorities. Finally, Sean Mannion is a neuroscientist and chief scientific officer at Consensus Health, which is a small and medium enterprises. How can I stop my sorry. It's there. Stop sharing. Okay, so we will open the floor to you, the audience, and I'm talking to you after the presentation of the 4 speakers, so that you can make comments or ask questions. You'll be able to turn on your mic thanks to the help of Alexandra, who is helping us technically today. You're also encouraged to write questions in the Q&A or the chat box, where my colleagues Lee and Agatha will be monitoring your questions. We'll take questions at the end of the presentations, but we might, if there are follow-up questions, take some of them during the presentations. Without further ado, we start with you, Richard. So you are going to present the privacy dimension of the discussion today. The questions for you that I have will be the following. How do data protection authorities cooperate to ensure trust on the internet globally? And how do privacy governance principles and rules facilitate data flows and contribute to international trade growth? Over to you, Richard. I have to share my screen for you. Oh. Share my screen and no.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. All right, I'm in your hands.
Thanks, Cian. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to speak to everybody on the webinar today and to have this opportunity to engage with you all. So as Cian mentioned, my name's Rick Sayers. I work at the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK Data Protection Authority. And I'm today speaking also on behalf of the Global Privacy Assembly, which the ICO currently chairs. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Global Privacy, so I thought I'd start off by just explaining a little bit about who the Global Privacy Assembly is, for those who don't know. So the Global Privacy Assembly is the premier global forum for data protection and privacy authorities to interact with each other and to cooperate with each other. As I said, it's currently chaired by the UK Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, and so the ICO, her office, we provide the secretariat function for the Global Privacy Assembly, and we will be the chair for the next year until the next conference. So the GPA has been around since 1979. It has been around for a while, although it was until fairly recently called the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners, which was a bit of a mouthful. So one of the things that actually we've overseen as part of our chairship of the GPA is the change of name to the Global Privacy Assembly. And we recently held our 42nd annual assembly, which was scheduled to be in Mexico. Unfortunately, because of the current situation, we're not able to travel. So we held that as a virtual conference at the end. But we think it went pretty well, and we're currently in the process of digesting all the output from that. So that was in the middle of October. So it was only about a month ago that we held that. So the purpose of the goal of the GPA is to be an outstanding global forum for privacy and data protection authorities. The idea is that we can disseminate knowledge, provide practical assistance to help different authorities more effectively perform their mandates, and to provide leadership on international level data protection and privacy issues. And by connecting and supporting those efforts at both domestic and regional level, we also want to connect with other international forums such as the World Trade Organization and the Internet Governance Forum, so that we can provide that expertise in data protection to these questions that we're talking about today. So can I have the next slide, please? So just briefly, that's the GPA's vision, which is, as it says there, an environment in which privacy and data protection authorities around the world are able to effectively act to fulfill their mandates, both individually and in concert through diffusion of knowledge and supportive connections. So we're there to try and assist each other as data protection authorities. So can I, next slide, please, thank you. So they're the three strategic priorities for the next, for the next year. They've been the strategic priorities since 2019. And the idea is that obviously we want to advance global privacy in a digital age, and we want to do that by working towards a global regulatory environment that has clear and consistently high standards of data protection. We want to maximise the GPA's voice and its influence. So we want to enhance its role in wider digital policy and also strengthen our relationships with other international bodies and networks in order to advance data protection and privacy issues, including through things like observer arrangements, for example, with other forums. And we also have observer, we have other organisations can be a GPA observer as well. And finally, we want to help build capacity amongst the assembly members. There is quite a wide spectrum of capability and of resourcing and of experience within the GPA. With at one end we have some very experienced privacy regulators such as the ICO, such as the other European privacy regulators who've been around for a long time. But we also have some quite new data protection authorities who are regulating quite nascent data protection regimes. And so the idea is that by working together, we can help build their capacity and build their knowledge by sharing the experience we have. And actually, in some ways, those newer authorities are in an interesting position because they can create the data protection regime purpose-built for the digital age that we're in now, as opposed to having to try to adapt to it as some of the older authorities and older regimes have had to. So I think there's a really interesting future there in terms of how newer data protection regimes are built with the digital world in mind. So on the next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on a few things that some work streams that the GPA has been dealing with over the last year. It's a relatively new thing that over the last year we split into a number of different policy work streams, and there are, I think, 3 of them that are particularly relevant to the conversation today. So the first one is some work that we did over the last year to analyse different global frameworks and standards, to look at what the differences are between them and what where the points of difference are, and also where they're similar. So that's just a list of the 10 that we looked at. You'll see the GDPRs in there. There's also some well-established things such as the OECD privacy guidelines, Convention 108, which is the only legally binding data protection standard globally. And then there's also some newer things such as the Madrid resolution, which is a GPA resolution, which laid out a set of common standards for the GPA members in order to help them build their data protection regimes. If we can take the next slide, please.
Richard?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me? Can I get the next slide, please?
Yeah, I'm facing some internet connection issues, that's why.
Oh, no worries. Thank you very much, Jason. No problem. So I think the first thing that we'd like to stress about that was that we found that there were strong commonalities between many of the different frameworks. The basic principles of data protection law are fairly well established. However, there were differences in particularly in mechanisms for facilitating cross-border data. So although the principles that most of those frameworks have when it comes to cross-border transfers were quite similar in terms of basically allowing data to, the data should continue to enjoy the protection that it enjoys in its country of origin when it goes abroad, the mechanisms for ensuring that were quite different, and there were many different ways of doing that. So over the next year, we do intend to carry out some further analysis, more specifically on the cross-border transfer mechanisms, to see how they differ in practice, where they're similar, and start to look for those areas where perhaps there are areas of commonality where we can start to work towards a more interoperable system. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other work stream we're currently working on, and which I'm actually part of, is the digital economy work stream, and that's just a quick look there at what the mandate of that work stream is. So the digital economy work stream is looking to basically create a narrative, a more coherent approach to issues of data protection regulation in the digital economy amongst GPA members, but also to to look at that closer engagement with multilateral and international bodies. And this webinar is part of that work that we'd like to do now, to try to reach out to different forums, to talk to forums where data protection issues are important, but which are not part of the core mandate, because obviously we think that we can contribute to that, but also that we can learn from the practical issues that the people that we're regulating face. Next slide, please. So as part of that, we did a background paper called Towards a Trustworthy Digital Economy, which lays out our view of what the digital economy is, what are the important developments, and what are the main things that we need to look at in this context. I'm sorry, if I can just take the next slide again, please. And so one of the things that we really wanted to point out in that paper, and I think the point, if you want bringing it to the point of today and the point that we'd like to make as the GPA, is that there are systemic benefits to data protection regulation when it comes to a vibrant digital economy. And that would include, we would say, data flows across borders. So when we say digital economy, we mean a global digital economy. And they are a sustainable level playing field. We do believe that data, trust is something that's hard to gain, but it's very easily lost. And while certain uses of personal data can yield economic growth in the short term, if those uses are detrimental to individuals, they do eventually become detrimental to the digital economy as a whole. So we think that appropriate laws and regulations, combined with appropriate oversight of those laws and regulations by supervisory authorities and by courts, ultimately, it does help to ensure that all data controllers are working in a level playing field, that they can innovate in ways that maintain customer confidence and that allow people to enjoy the protections of data protection law, but also realise the benefits of the digital economy. We also believe that it does enhance the choice of individuals and also prevents harms to them, so they are able to make informed choices about the services that they use, and that consumers are increasingly aware of the risks that data, the misuse of their data could lead to. So there's also an opportunity there for a competitive advantage for organisations that can sell their products on the basis of it being privacy friendly, and we really do think that that is a selling point now. Again, all part of this point of trust, which we think is so important. And again, we do believe data protection is a driver for innovation, and at the ICO, we have a sandbox which allows organisations to come and test out new ideas in a more closely supervised environment, so that they can, as I said, use data in new ways, but in a way which still respects the basics of data protection law. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm slightly overrunning, so I will wrap up. So just kind of the key takeaways from that, we would say is that the trust is key to a vibrant digital economy. That you need trust from users in the systems that they're using, and also between different countries if you're sharing data across borders. And data protection law is a vital building block of that trust. So we therefore don't believe that data protection law should be seen as a barrier to economic activity. We don't believe this is a question of data protection or economic benefit. We believe that they go hand in hand, and that with a modern, well-regulated, sensible data protection regime, you enable data flows. In terms of data flows across the globe, of course, the more harmonized that can be, the more interoperable those systems can be, the easier it will be for data to flow between borders, and the less frictions there'll be between different for those data flows. Next slide, please. It's the last one. So the last work stream that I think, again, is just a good example of working together and how it helps with the international enforcement cooperation work stream. So this is something, again, that has been relatively newly established. It provides a forum in which members can discuss live issues, leading to joint working on matters of mutual concern. So particularly where you have multinational organisations that are operating in different countries, it's very useful to be able to talk to each other in that forum and to coordinate our actions. And that has led to two concrete enforcement cooperation initiatives. So that was a joint investigation between ourselves, the ICO, and the Australian Information Commissioner into Clearview, an organisation called Clearview AI, and also an open letter with a joint statement on global privacy expectations of video conferencing companies, signed by 6 member authorities of that cooperation. Obviously, that's become more and more important in the current situation where we're much more reliant on video conferencing suites at the moment. So thank you very much. My final slide just has some links to the GPA website where you can get more information on all of those things. And like I said, the GPA website has a lot of information on there about the work that we do. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing it with you further.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
All right, let's turn now to the next speakers, Carl and Jade. So we've heard from Richard that privacy governance is key to generate trust and can contribute to digital economic growth. And for us, for WTO, international trade growth, that's what matters for us, at least. Of course, there are other policy objectives pursued by data policies than just privacy, such as fostering market competition and innovation, or protecting national security interests. So taking that into account, I'd like to ask you, Carl, first, if you can tell us more about the relationship between those different data policies. Give you just to name one, data localization rules, and the global architecture of the internet. Carl, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kian. I'll share my screen here, prepare a presentation. Hope everyone can see it. Perfect.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel. I think we're all contributing different complementary angles to this really important topic. The angle that I will be presenting is stemming from some of the work that we've been doing in 2020 at the Internet Society about a impact assessment toolkit for the internet, trying to understand how different policies or technologies or other developments might impact this global architecture that we call the internet, and looking specifically at the case of forced data localization in this context. So I usually start these presentations with this picture just to give people a sense of what we're trying to do, because If you look at this image, you will see that there is a forest and then there's a highway surrounding it. And ideally, someone will have considered what is the impact on that ecosystem in the forest and that forest itself when you decided to build a highway. And this has kind of become the norm in many countries around the world, that we do these type of impact assessments because we assign a high value to the environment. And it's become almost a reflex in many communities to do that type of impact assessment. And we're hoping to do something similar for the internet. And that's the work that we're working on this year, trying to contextualize and describe the impact of different choices and how it relates to the internet. So what we did in order to achieve this and start building this work, this is a work in progress, I should say, is that the first step is kind of trying to articulate what is it that is really important about the internet? What is that critical thing that needs to be strengthened and preserved going forward? And then step number 2 here is try to provide a lens or other tools for people to assess the impact on the internet itself. And that resulted in this Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. And starting with that first question, if we're thinking about trying to describe what's important to preserve, it's useful to try to articulate the internet in some way, shape, or form. And what you see on the screen is one of the ways that people usually describe the internet. It's a network of networks. But there's also a bit of a so what question to that. That seems to be a necessary but not a sufficient description to talk about the internet. So if you were to sort of conceptually visualize the internet, it would look something like this. You would have networks of internet hosts interconnecting, and together they create this global platform that we call the internet, in which you have these amazing innovations and creations that is sort of fueling the global economy today. Now, what we wanted to do is sort of add a little bit of more detail to that. So we're talking about a network of networks, a internet, but can we add a little bit more detail as to what that capitalized I global internet that we have today, what defines it, what characterizes it? So we started looking at some of the very fundamentals together with our community and other experts, trying to identify what are those critical properties that comes to define the internet, and what are their ideal state. What would be the ideal way of doing this networking model? And the purpose of this is to establish that baseline that you then assess different policy developments towards. And hopefully what you see on the screen here should resonate with many people. It shouldn't be any novelties in here, that when we're talking about the internet, we should be striving to have a common protocol, for example. We should have a common global identifier system in terms of IP addresses and the domain system, for example. But there are also ideals in this sense, right? Because we know, for example, that in the current internet, we have 2 protocols in IPv4, IPv6. But in the networking model, you're striving to have one protocol. You're striving to have that shift to IPv6, for example. But each one of these properties are trying to describe things that are critical for us to talk about the internet and that capitalized I internet and preserving that networking model. And the idea here is that you'll be able to add a little bit more detail to this conceptualization of what the internet is. It's not only a network of networks, it's a network of networks that have a common protocol, that have a common identifier system, that is general purpose, and so forth. And by doing so, you can also start thinking about, when do we move away from the internet? When do we start harming the internet? When do we start degrading the internet? And then you end up with these question marks. If you move away from a common protocol, if you move away from having a general purpose network, if you move away from having a high degree of autonomy of the participating networks, then you move away from the internet as a networking model and you get something different. You do not have the capitalized I internet anymore. So that is what we're trying to convey in this toolkit. And we're describing these critical properties as being associated with important benefits that we've achieved today. So for example, the fact that you have an accessible infrastructure with a common protocol means that it's very low barriers to entry to participate in the internet. You speak IP, and then you can deliver your service online. Simplified, but basically it creates these low barriers to entry. Similarly, if you look at something like decentralized management and distributed routing, the critical importance of that is that you have networks that are able to optimize their interconnections and routing to serve local needs while still maintaining a worldwide connectivity. So that autonomy of networks participating in this networking model is critically important to have the internet that we have today. Similarly, that general purpose network that allows the network to just move bits and bytes, and then the innovations are coming at the edges. Critically important to preserve an internet going forward. So I'm now going to move to that second step in this toolkit, where we have a lens for different, what we call use cases, and trying to articulate how they affect these fundamentals of the internet. And it's important to think about them as fundamentals because they don't capture everything that's important about the internet, for example. It's only looking at those critical fundamental pieces and how they're affected by different policies and what you might lose through some of those policies, or how those policies might strengthen the properties as well. So we created a number of use cases in this work, and we have more coming in 2021. But I'll talk very briefly about the case of forced data localization, which is one of the angles of today's conversation. So if you think about forced data localization, you could describe it as you see on the screen here, that it refers to government requirements that control the storage and flow of data kept within a particular jurisdiction. Now that can come roughly in two different forms. Either we're talking about data at rest, which just means that the data is physically located within a country. You also have other types of sort of data localization requirements that is about data traffic, not traversing networks across borders, for example. So they can come in different forms. I think today we're going to talk more about the data at rest case. But the idea behind these use cases is that we're trying to illustrate with such requirements, what is the impact on these critical properties? And I've listed them here on the screen. I won't go into them in detail now. I think we will discuss to great extent the impact on that first critical property in terms of data localization requirements, sort of raising barriers for participation of services on the internet. Because in effect, if you have these type of requirements where they're very indiscriminate, you would need multiple sort of duplications of your infrastructure in order to comply with the law. So you wouldn't just require to have, one web server in a country, but you need to duplicate that across jurisdictions and so forth. Similarly, the general purpose network, if you start having requirements about how traffic can flow across the networks and across borders, then you're adding requirements in terms of these networks becoming content aware and doing traffic management in a way that is not in line with this general purpose idea. But we also have here critical property 3 about the decentralized management and distributed routing. And I was thinking I should try to illustrate this a little bit better visually. I usually find it helpful to get a visual description of some of these issues. But the idea here is that the fact that you have these data localization requirements when we're talking about data at rest is that it doesn't really correspond to how the internet itself looks at the world, if you will. So if you think about how we as humans look at the world, we would look at it in this fashion, kind of. We would see it in countries and in country borders. We will look at relationships between those countries in terms of those borders. So the relationship between country A and country D, for example, is that in between them, you have country C and country B. That's how we kind of think about the world as humans. But this is quite different from how the participants or networks and services in the internet looks at the world, if you will. So rather, when you're on the internet, you think about the internet from a network topology point of view. So you're looking at relationships among networks, and they might not correspond to national borders. So here in this example, this is kind of a miniature version of the internet describing a network topology. And if you were a cloud provider, let's say, and you had the option of allocating your resources in network A or in network B, you're faced with a choice here. Where am I most likely to more efficiently deliver this content, for example, to clients across the world? And by looking at this map, just very stylistically, it looks like network A would be beneficial or more beneficial than network B for a few reasons. For example, if you're in network A, you basically have 3 hops to any other network in this map. If you're in network B, you will have 5 hops to some of these networks. Also, for example, you have a higher degree of interconnection in this part of the graph than you have here. And those are the type of rationales that you can benefit from when you're looking at the internet, because the internet doesn't have this idea of borders. It looks at interconnection patterns and where it's most efficient to allocate resources. And the problem is when you're trying to sort of impose that geographical constraints on the networks, because it doesn't map very well. You have networks that cross borders, And just because you have a resource within one country doesn't mean that it would actually improve the service delivery for users in that country. You might actually have better service delivery if you're having your resources stored in a network in a neighboring country. So you're sort of losing these benefits of the interconnectedness of the internet through these data localization requirements. So those are the type of issues that we try to bring forward in this toolkit as considerations when you look at different policies, including trade policies like this, that you start losing some of the benefits of the internet, the global reach, the interconnectedness, and the efficiencies that an interconnected network can give you in terms of promoting your economy and promoting your services. And they can be put at risk from very stringent and broad data localization requirements, for example. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. That was really interesting. One follow-up question that we can ask you later will be whether or not privacy rules or governance will affect one, at least, of the 5 properties of the internet, and, for example, decentralized management, whether or not privacy governance will influence the decision of cloud service providers to locate the servers. My gut feeling is no, because we are talking about data transmission and not the content of data, but I'll be happy to hear your views on that. Before that I go to the next speaker, I'd like to see with Agatha if there are follow-up questions from the Q&A.
Yes, there is actually one question, but that question was addressed to a previous speaker, to Richard. So we can ask it now if you want, or leave that for later.
Not sure if it's a follow-up.
So the question for Richard was from Len, which has asked that, which has said that there has been discussion of the DNS over HTTPS DOH implementations in the context of cross-border data and privacy. Is that something that GPA would consider?
Before we Richard, you take the there's a mute.
Hello?
Mute your microphone, please. Just before that, I give you the floor, Richard. Lee, on your side, in the chat box and in YouTube, are there any follow-up questions?
Well, we're not having our YouTube people posing any questions as yet, but you've got 3 thumbs up in the YouTube.
Thank you. Richard, you go ahead, and maybe Carl, you can address the question as well.
So I typed a response on the Q&A, so apologies if I should have waited to answer. But I can yeah. I mean, basically, I don't think it is something that's been discussed at GPA. I'll admit I'm not an expert on internet protocols, so I'm not sure it's something that I could answer at this point. But certainly, it's certainly something we can take away and look at and raise with colleagues. The only thing I would say is data protection law is generally it tries to be technology agnostic, so it wouldn't usually specify or endorse a particular standard or a particular protocol or a particular technology. You know, all these things have pros for privacy and they have cons for other things, and you know, I don't think there's one that's perfect. So generally, what data protection law and what privacy standards try to do is set principles, but which leave space for data controllers to choose the best solution for them, if you like, in those circumstances. Now, clearly, from a kind of cybersecurity thing, the more secure something is, the better. But of course, that has to be balanced with whether it allows you to fulfill what it is that you're trying to do. So I'm not sure that, I'm sorry if that doesn't answer the question, because as I say, I'm not an expert on internet protocols, so I don't know if that quite gets to the nub of the question. But it's certainly something we can I can take back and mention that has been raised, and we can consider whether it fits into any of the discussions that we're having at the moment. And it's something that I think if you have a more in-depth question on how you feel that relates to privacy law, then of course we'd be happy to take it away and have a think about it.
Carl?
Is it in response to the DNS question or the other question?
The other question. Except if you want to address the DNS as well.
Well, I'm not sure if I would have a clear response to it. I think it's an interesting question, though, and probably relevant for Richard's work, given that I think perhaps the question by the participant was sort of thinking about, so one of the rationales behind DNS over HTTPS is that you get an encrypted connection to the DNS resolver, and trusted resolvers today has been the big players that might not be located within the geographical jurisdictions. You might access a resolver outside of borders, which is sort of a move from how it traditionally have been within your access network. So it's probably an interesting question for Richard's future work, for sure. With regards to the privacy rules, I think the key here is coherency, and some of the things that we've seen in terms of, for example, I don't want to say undermine, but coming in conflict with some of the benefits of the internet is something you can see illustrated with the GDPR, for example. The GDPR was an extremely needed data protection regulation, and it certainly has improved a lot for internet users, not only in Europe, but also globally. The crux in it is that although it moves the needle forward in a very, very positive fashion, it also comes with, for example, an extraterritorial application where other providers outside of Europe have, in some instances, decided to not make themselves available to users in Europe. So if you could try to visit, for example, the Atlantic in the US, that website, it usually says that it won't resolve in Europe because of GDPR. And of course, that is not in any shape or form sort of breaking the technical interoperability of the internet, but you're adding this sort of or legal conflicts that emerge, and suddenly you do not gain the full benefits of that sort of global technical connectivity because you have conflicting regulations that sort of prohibits people from making themselves available globally. So the point is that this coherence is incredibly important because it could affect your utility and usefulness of having a global network.
Okay, that's where the interoperability data transfers model that Richard mentioned becomes really key for allowing international trade, or at least the flow of services and goods across borders. Richard, you want to say something before we?
I was just going to say, would you like me to say something on that, or do you want to wait until
the last question we received from Jack?
Sorry, let me just bring up the Q&A just to check. So, I mean, as to this, yeah, I think first of all, I would say that part of the purpose of data protection law is to allow data flows. So, so we certainly would hope that it is not being used as a intentional barrier to data flows and to economic activity and to trade. We, of course, I think the problem is, like you say, that when you have differences between different systems, that can create a barrier. Not an intentional barrier, but a barrier there because you are transferring data between two places that have quite often very different views on how data protection work. They're coming at it from different views. They see it through a different optic. And that's where we hope that forums like the GPA, and by engaging with other forums, we can try to sort of to break down those barriers and to come up with common standards, common principles, at least that mean that even though the legal system may be different, even though I think we have to respect that different countries have different legal systems, have different views on these things, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to build interoperability between those systems by recognizing a common set of principles and a common set of standards. And I think actually when you look around the world, the basic principles of data protection are fairly well established. I don't think there's many countries that have a completely different view. It's just how you achieve those things. So no, I'd hope, very much from our perspective at the ICO at least, and I think I speak for most GPA members in this sense, that no, we support trade, we support the ability of data to flow as long as that is in a way that maintains the protections that the data enjoys. And I think the answer is, not the answer, that's too simplistic way of putting it, but certainly it would help to look at where we can find those commonalities between systems to allow data to flow more soundly. And I think, but yeah, I've just reinforced the point that the purpose of data protection law being put in place is actually to create a common set of standards, or certainly in Europe, is to create a common set of data protection standards so that data can flow unimpeded without this friction that you get with different standards in different countries.
That's an excellent point. Thank you so much. Let's turn to Jade. Jade, what about you? What can you tell us how mobile operators benefit from cross-border data flows and how are they affected by data policies? Over to you.
Everyone see my slides? I think so. Okay. Well,
yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jade Nester, and I'm Director of Consumer Policy at the GSMA. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. For those of you who don't know what the GSMA is, we're a trade association and we represent the views of nearly 800 mobile network operators worldwide. And we also represent about 300 companies from the broader mobile ecosystem. So that includes handset and device makers, software companies, and different companies in the mobile ecosystem. So it's quite a broad array of companies that depend on cross-border data flows, which is why I'm here today talking about it. Much like Richard, we really want to start with privacy as the basis for these discussions about cross-border data flows, privacy and accountability as a core privacy principle. Back in 2011, the GSMA developed mobile privacy principles, which are based on these commonly accepted fair information practice principles that Richard also mentioned. So these were a mobile industry facing set of principles, and we also developed some privacy design guidelines for app developers based on those principles. But more recently, we developed this report on smart data privacy laws. And this was in 2019. The idea was to have a resource for our members to figure out what the best type of privacy laws are worldwide as they encounter revised and new privacy frameworks in their jurisdictions. But this is also intended as a tool for policymakers, in part because we would get asked in consultations or directly what our views were as a global trade association. So we wanted to have some sort of benchmark tool to talk about what we think a smart privacy law entails. And I think a lot of what is in that report actually mirrors elements that Richard mentioned earlier in terms of embedding things like privacy by design, privacy impact assessments, having a law that is sector neutral, technology neutral, horizontal like the GDPR is, and focused on the risk of harm to individuals. So that forces organizations to really think through the privacy risk process and then mitigate those risks. But really what underscores our report and just our view on privacy and data flows in general is the importance of accountability. We think that's the bedrock that all of these other elements are built on. And we think that accountability is also what can facilitate data flows globally. Because data flows require trust. You know, it's about trust between governments and individuals, governments and companies, and privacy is a critical part of trust. And being able to demonstrate as an organization that you are doing the right thing, that you are abiding by the law, that is what is also going to facilitate trust. So this has been hugely important for us. You know, why are cross-border data flows so important to the mobile industry? Well, in general, obviously, for the digital economy, cross-border data flows are hugely important. You can build businesses based on your local area and have global customers, both for goods and services. And for our operators, we are fueling that, you know, through connectivity, fueling that growing global data economy. But our members also need to be able to send data across borders, sometimes for reasons like if they have a global footprint themselves and they need to send data from one jurisdiction to another for HR purposes. Increasingly, some of the elements of networks that were physical hardware are becoming virtualized or cloud-based. And so we need cross-border data flows to make it worthwhile to scale up to those more efficient cloud-based systems, which then of course creates benefits for consumers if the network is better and managed as effectively as possible. So these are some of the benefits. Some of the specific issues that apply to mobile operators are that telecom license obligations sometimes include restrictions that prevent mobile network operators from sending data abroad. Sometimes that's public, like in India, there's a universal license that includes some data localization requirements. Sometimes it's more of a confidential requirement that the mobile operator obviously knows about because it's their license obligation, but that the broader public might not know about. And also the mobile operator, or just telecoms in general, would have to deal with that license obligation, whereas other players in the ecosystem may not. So it's not necessarily an issue of wanting to lower the bar. It's more like bringing the bar up for everyone in a way that is workable and actually facilitates innovation in data flows. Because we're so committed to this issue, we've issued a number of reports in this area. One of these reports on realizing benefits and removing barriers for cross-border data flows made a number of recommendations, and including things like committing to cross-border data flows and removing unnecessary localization measures. We also had a number of high-level recommendations which are similar to the ones that were in our smart data privacy laws report, including removing legacy sector-specific privacy rules, particularly if they include some sort of localization requirement, encouraging regional data privacy initiatives. So basically the regional version of some of the frameworks that Richard spoke about earlier, and just making privacy frameworks more fit for purpose for the digital age, and addressing government concerns. We separated out national security, law enforcement with surveillance, because we see those as different issues with different solutions. And we know that these are ongoing debates, particularly in the European context. The European Data Protection Supervisor just put out, not supervisor, rather the board put out guidelines on data flows post Schrems, where the privacy shield was invalidated. But a number of the recommendations actually in those guidelines are similar to things that we have in this report that we did. But in addition to that, we also have been looking at specific regional frameworks more intensely. So taking this third recommendation and really doing a deep dive. In ASEAN in particular, starting in 2016, we started engaging with the ASEAN countries and also looking at the ASEAN privacy framework and figuring out how that can be useful for increasing privacy protections across the region, but then also for facilitating data flows. So we took that, and we also asked a very detailed survey of our members and governments in 2017, talking about privacy practices and talking about what would be useful for the member states and for our members in terms of facilitating data flows and best practices. And we used some of that information for a report on regional privacy frameworks and cross-border data flows. And this report is quite detailed, substantive, looking at commonalities between the APEC privacy framework, the ASEAN privacy work, also looking at some of these other global frameworks that Richard mentioned in terms of Convention 108 and the OECD guidelines, and then mapping all of those privacy principles, trying to figure out how certain elements of the APEC cross-border privacy rules system could potentially be brought into the ASEAN framework to cover that entire area. And one of the things that we landed on was the development of something called the regulatory pilot space, which is a sandbox, like Richard mentioned, that is specifically focused on discrete data flow issues. So this is a safe space to test policy ideas, and specifically it was looking at cross-border data flows between a region that has a localization provision, for example, and then one that does not, or one that has a more developed privacy framework and one with a less developed privacy framework. Basically how you can bridge those gaps between frameworks and to build trust between a specific set of ASEAN member states. And if we look at the next slide, this is just a rough diagram of how this works. There's a paper, which maybe I can put in the chat, which explains the regulatory pilot space more. But it's basically, for those of you who are familiar with the APEC cross-border privacy rules system, it's kind of a lighter touch version of that, specifically between two member states, to be able to facilitate data flows between the member states. So there are governance controls around it, and there's an accountability and enforcement mechanism as well. And this should help with trust between countries. But we're still working on this, and we still have support from ASEAN. It's more that we're looking at the best company and companies to try to get this off the ground. So we're still excited to have support from the region, but it is still a work in progress. We haven't stopped there, though. I'll end on this slide talking about some of the work that we've been looking at across the Middle East and Northern Africa, that we did a report, which is very long, but there's also a summary to it as well, where we looked at all of the privacy frameworks, if they exist, and then telecom laws, other types of laws that have privacy and data governance elements across the MENA region. And we mapped those against GDPR principles. And the idea here is to figure out, like Richard said earlier, to figure out where those different principles are in common, so that later, if you want to facilitate data flows across the region or across 2 or 3 countries specifically, you can figure out where those gaps are between countries and then develop some sort of accountability mechanism to be able to facilitate data flows between those countries to make sure that there's trust. And the interesting thing about this region is that even from when we put this out in 2019 to now, there are new privacy laws in the region. So the Egyptian privacy law was passed after we put this report out. And we know that there are a few draft pieces of legislation in the region as well. So I think this is an interesting area where things are changing, and you're getting GDPR style rules in these different countries and different independent regulators as well. So I'll close on that and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jade. I'll come back to one of your slides on this sandbox. I think it's interesting that we dive deeper into that. I'll give the floor to you, Sean, and then we take some questions, follow-up questions to Jade's presentation. So Sean, we've discussed extensively about data privacy governance. And as I said in the introduction, data policies can be introduced for achieving different types of objectives. And one of them is to promote and foster competition and innovation. So you work in the health sector, and so it will be great if you can share your experience with us on how data can be used to foster competition in the health sector.
Certainly, and thank you. And thank you to Lee and Agata and Ken from World Trade Organization, along with the IGF for having me here. I enjoy moving outside of the health sector sometimes. I think there are greater challenges, but also greater opportunities for innovation and growth in the health sector that we can share and learn from. My name is Sean Mannion. I'm actually a neuroscientist by training, and I spent a long time in the US federal government overseeing networked research and research administration. Got to learn the pain points and the opportunities of data flow and data stoppage. I moved into the health tech sector in 2017. Blockchain technology was, for me, the inroads to looking more at what could be done with emerging technology in healthcare. And I think what I'd like to do today is introduce sort of a new paradigm of what is being done with health data in a way that probably has implications not only on the regulatory side, but also on cooperation and competition and new opportunities in trade. The blockchain technology, I'm not going to go into the details, but has arisen very rapidly over the last decade in a number of different industries. Health lags a little bit behind, something like finance or supply chain, but there are a large number of companies that have begun setting up consortiums to explore the use of this technology. The value proposition for using this technology in healthcare is much greater from a consortium standpoint, sharing some data so that you can compete with other aspects of your data. In this, it resembles so far a lot of other industries, use in supply chain, healthcare supply chain, use in pay and remittance, use in sharing information from provider directory, has really been the baby steps, or the initial look at what this data, at what this technology can do. But health data itself is sort of the gold. That is the most valuable thing, but it is also the most heavily regulated, and it sets up some of the challenges for how that data flows, not only for individuals' health, but also in public health crisis like we're in now with COVID-19, along with what are the opportunities for the different type of businesses to thrive in this new environment. When thinking about health data, it is good to think about not only the regulatory compliance, but the cybersecurity aspects, privacy aspects above and beyond those that are written into regulation, and of course the bioethics and the identity of those individuals and those organizations involved in healthcare and health research. And so it's this wider framework that we keep in mind as we look at what some of the new technologies that we have can do for sharing the information that's necessary, but not sharing the data that's not necessary. This new paradigm shift, and if there's one thing that you can take away from this, that moving copies of data is no longer the only way to create value from that data. We're looking at how you can share knowledge and not necessarily have to move the data, so that the data flow and the regulations relating to the data flow no longer become a barrier to more rapid advances in healthcare and health application at both population level as well as a personal level. In this, I'll use this diagram to sort of visualize what we're talking about. There's a tremendous amount of source data in any industry, but in healthcare especially. Oftentimes, people move from one locality to another, or need treatment for some sort of problem in one place and need to get the data from another place. There are regulations and the GDPR in the US, HIPAA, and in many localities, a variety of different privacy preserving health regulations that can be a constraint to moving the data around, to even getting treatment with the doctor having the best data available. And of course, in a public health crisis like the current pandemic, it becomes a very big barrier to advancing not only public health treatment, but the innovation and some of the new creation that can come out of that. But by looking more closely at just this derived data and focusing on the derived data, we have a smaller set of data that if we can share this, if it's de-identified, there may be ways of advancing both treatment as well as business associated with innovative treatments without violating any of the regulatory barriers that are already in place. Data is becoming a very big challenge and issue in just its volume, but in healthcare, it is certainly the case that there's just a huge amount of health data that is coming into play. And as things get more advanced, some of the imaging, if you used to just get an X-ray and that's a very small amount of data, now you get an MRI, this is a much larger amount of data. And as more and more technology advances how we treat and how we assess health, sharing that data becomes almost impossible to do. So it's not only a regulatory issue, it becomes a real world challenge in where that data is stored, how quickly you can transfer large amounts of data. And so this new paradigm and this new approach is really looking at not moving data around, but instead leaving the data where it is and having those, instead of large data silos, be local data repositories. And those can be tapped into in a unique way with a new array of technologies. And here I'm not going to get into heavy technical depth, but I'd just like to introduce these three families of technologies, being blockchain, privacy in depth as we call it, but it can go by different names, and decentralized AI. So built really on the current Web 2.0, this is the foundation for in health, what is being called Web 3.0. Blockchain provides a variety of functionality. The deployment of smart contracts, which are really just programs to automate some analysis or quality assurance and things that would already be done in a reliable, automated, and verifiable and auditable way, become very powerful. Tokenization and incentivization is a basic use case in blockchain for finance, Bitcoin, Ethereum, those applications. In healthcare, it becomes a much more advanced application. And so here it is optional, but it is something that people are exploring. But blockchain alone is really just a rail of security and trust that different parties can tap into. The real power in deploying decentralized AI or deploying an algorithm to the data so that you don't need to move that data around and just having the derived data come back to you is where a lot of this new functionality can come from. Right now, machine learning is very powerful, but there's a lot of challenges with both the ethics of it as well as the viability of it when it comes to who touched the data, what was the data, what machine learning data was used for training that data, training the algorithm. All of these things can be open, transparent, and audible with the use of blockchain. So this is why partnering these two technologies is so powerful. But finally, in healthcare especially, you need to preserve privacy. And there's a host of new technologies, zero knowledge proofs, trusted execution environment, when layered over these two other applications, allow you to essentially have your data lake or an individual's data lake exist across the planet and never moving that data outside of the local municipalities, and also deploying algorithms and smart contracts that can be set for the particular privacy regulations of each place where that data may sit. You can pool and derive this, this combined or derived data for a population health question that I may have, for an individual personal question that I may have. And I think that changes the paradigm entirely of what can be done with data, how data flows can and will match the regulatory barriers that are necessarily in place, and how we can do things to advance health from population to a personal level in a new and different way. I'll stop there and we can jump to questions for me and the others as well.
Brilliant. Am I muted? No, I'm not. Thank you so much, Sean and Jade. Agatha, do you have follow-up questions in the Q&A?
Yes, Kian, there are follow-up questions, and there is a follow-up question to Richard, and there is a follow-up question to Jade as well. So maybe I'll start with the one for Jade, because Jade was talking about some framework, and the question from Judith is, what suggestions do you have for this pragmatic framework you mentioned on how to convince countries that data localization is not the answer to avoid surveillance or law enforcement outside the country?
Yeah, I think in terms of the foreign surveillance question, we pointed to encryption in particular in that report. I think that's something that's also been echoed in the guidance in the EU on data flows with the US. That data needs to be, or one of the safeguards you can apply to data is that it's encrypted and that the key is kept in the EU. I think in practice, as technology becomes more sophisticated, a number of the techniques that Sean just mentioned will actually be used more in practice. Things where you can learn from the data remotely, things like secure multi-party computation, where not every party involved has access to a full data set, yet you can still glean insights from data. I think things like that will be become more critical, and more people will be implementing them, because I think in practice, you're going to have to use some sort of cryptographic method to protect data from surveillance if there's no legal basis for it, basically. Or if, for example, in the EU's case, it's been deemed disproportionate. In terms of the law enforcement element of it, in the report, we mentioned things like the effort in the US to advance the Cloud Act and Cloud Act agreements in various countries, basically some sort of improved version of the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty framework. In the EU, there's been an effort to look at the e-evidence process, so basically even within the EU, the process to get information from one country to another, and from service providers in different EU states. And there are still some issues in that area in terms of streamlining that process and making it effective, and to prevent service providers from being basically deputized by law enforcement to assess the legality of requests. That's not a position that we want to be in, where service providers are having to evaluate every request. So there does need to be some sort of better centralized way of dealing with it. But I think the short answer is it's up to, in that case, stakeholders to work with governments to try to push them in the right direction and to figure out something that is that works in the governmental level.
Thanks, Jade. Let's take a couple of questions. Agatha, do you have more follow-up questions in the Q&A?
There are actually quite a few follow-up questions, and I think one that is quite interesting relates to unfair competition. So Victoria is asking whether data protection laws are also a way for privacy-friendly countries to prevent dumping and unfair competition by businesses that are established in less privacy-friendly countries, that they could offer services for free at the lower prices because of increased possibilities to monetize the derived data without the consent of the users. So that is the question that relates to the unfair competition that some countries may be facing from those bigger, I suppose, companies from other jurisdictions. And I guess that's the question to all panelists, but particularly to Richard, I think.
We have more questions.
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
Richard, if I may, I just want to take all the questions and then we can open the floor.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, sorry.
Sorry for interrupting you, Richard. Again, do you have more questions? I see there are like few questions from Sean. For Sean.
Yes, there have been a couple of questions. One for that I think relates more to Sean is about opening access to data. The question talks about territorial assertions over cross-border data flow and concerns the social, commercial, and political value of data. The tension remains not because the nature of the cross-border flow is not understood, but because how various geographies access and share the valuable data. While various actors share data liberally in matters concerning health or environment, in technology and commerce, there are various barriers to sharing. So the question is, what work is the internet community doing on opening up access to all data that must be global?
Okay. As I'm writing, Lee.
There is another one which I can follow up straight away to Sean. Sean, are you suggesting that companies will adjust to data localization in the health sector by localizing AI processing? And can you provide concrete examples of companies or coalitions that implemented decentralized AI?
Certainly, and yeah, I'm sure there are more outside of healthcare, but to the last question first, OWKIN, O-W-K-I-N, is one of the leaders in deploying federated learning or decentralized AI in healthcare and health research in both Europe and the US. The Melody consortium that was mentioned on my first slide, which is a host of different pharma companies, again, in the US and in Europe, are also looking at how it deploys decentralized AI, and in this case, they're using the more advanced combination with blockchain for that auditability. What we're doing, and we are still pre-commercial, and our partners, I'm unfortunately not able to disclose at this point, but in spring of 2021, we should be launching our product and have a little bit more public discussion. But what we're doing is bringing this extra layer of privacy in. So I think in all those instances, you're starting to see the exploration, especially in research. The health research allows for the consenting. But moving to the other questions, whether or not you are getting the deployment of these algorithms locally so that the data doesn't need to move. Yes, it is happening in a very early stage. I think companies are looking at this reality both because of regulatory challenges, but also because of the volume of data and looking to do this more and more. One of the interesting questions, and I didn't have a chance to go into this in this short presentation, but the question of the access to that data and especially the imbalance in regulations across countries. One of the things that we're looking to do, and we spoke at a UN General Assembly related event recently and unveiled what we call the health utility grid. Is deploy this type of data and data access, but also patient data control, individuals controlling their own data as a new type of utility and a new type of way to empower both the individuals, particularly in instances where there's been historic discrimination or historic health disparities, to see if we cannot empower those individuals to be the ones who control the access. Now, I don't envision that everybody on the planet is going to immediately want control of the access of their own health data. Many people don't want to be bothered with that and want others. And so it may create the system of, just like you have a bank to control your money, you may have health banks to control your data, and you can set you can apply certain settings in this futuristic scenario I'm laying out of who gets access to your data, and also when you get recompensated for it. I may only allow pharma companies who have reached a certain threshold of ethical responsibility to access my data. I may only allow those companies who are giving me some sort of share of profits if it's a successful drug discovery to share my data, to access my data. But putting that access of data in the hands of the individual rather than controlling it by the access of necessarily each company or each municipality will level the playing field, but also open up new types of opportunity for competition. Because if you've got that sort of framework and that structure of fairness, if you will, but also wide open access, if you can make the pitch for, hey, I have a new company that is trying to gain access to people because I want to look at those with this behavioral profile and bring some new treatment to market. Groups may be more interested in sharing their data with me, small company, than some big company that has questionable uses of data and reselling data and problems in the past. So I think we're able to start to flip the dynamic, and it's started to happen in real world practice, but it's gonna take a little while.
Okay, wonderful. Richard, I'm going to give you the floor, but I just want to stress to the audience that if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question orally, we can turn on your microphone. So please let us know in the chat box whether or not you would like to intervene as well to share your perspective and experience with us. Richard, you had a question, I think.
Thank you. Sorry, just confirm this. The question that was addressed to me was the one about is it used as a way to prevent competition from other, or well, yeah. So I presume that's coming from the angle of preventing, should we say, unfair competition from other countries who don't have privacy law. So I'm sorry, I wasn't sure whether that was coming from the angle of does it create a barrier to competition, or is it a good thing for competition? So I think very much we would say that, of course, if you have services in other countries, so the starting point, if you like, in Europe at least, is that the individuals have a fundamental right to privacy and a fundamental right to data protection, and that is a right that must be respected by anybody who is offering services to citizens of those countries. So if you are a company operating in a different country that doesn't have those privacy standards, but you are targeting your services at the EU, then the GDPR very specifically says you must comply with the GDPR. They're the standards that you have to comply with if you want to offer services to EU citizens. Which I think is so. I don't think it would be a good thing to allow countries that don't have those privacy standards to offer services that can benefit, if you like, from using data in a way that they don't have to comply with those standards. I think that those standards are important. One thing I think what I'd go back to is to say, because I noticed one of the other questions on the chat was about how do you not every country has the same standard, have the same cultural values when it comes to privacy, and there are some countries where perhaps people are more willing to share their data. So how do you reconcile these things? I think we would say that the importance is that the individual has the choice, that they can choose and make an informed choice about what services they use, what data gets used as part of those services. I think, of course, there has to be a recognition on the privacy side of things that some services, there is a value exchange there. So you can't offer a service for free, effectively. So if you're not paying for it, you are paying for it somehow, and quite often that is through the use of your data. But I think the important thing is that if that is what a company is doing, they're clear and they're transparent with individuals about what data is being used, how that data is being used, and the individual has the choice. Then they can make that choice. I would say, and as I mentioned in my presentation, that poor privacy practices are not going to give you a competitive advantage in the long run. If anything, they're going to give your competitors who offer better privacy protections an advantage, because ultimately reputation is important, and I think people are more and more aware of how their data is being used and how it is affecting their privacy. And so people, I think, will stop choosing services if they realise that those services are not treating their data in a way that is appropriate. But of course, that relies on transparency, and that's what the law is there to ensure that those organisations provide transparency in how that data is being used. So I hope that answers the question, but if not, then please follow up.
Right. Just to back up on that, from a trade perspective, Vittorio's question is really interesting. I don't think it's a yes or no question. It really depends on the business models we're talking about. I'll give you a concrete example. Yesterday, we had a discussion with Mercado Libre. It's an e-commerce platform in Latin America, which is the equivalent of Amazon. And they are adopting what they call binding corporate rules. That's a term used in the GDPR as well. Those are simply corporate privacy guidelines. And any supplier using the e-commerce platform of Mercado Libre will have to abide with these corporate privacy guidelines of Mercado Libre, regardless of where they operate in the jurisdiction. So to Vittorio's question, I answer if, to give you an example, it's not the real case, but if Chile has a low privacy regulation, but a Chilean company wants to sell a product through the e-commerce platform, it will have to comply with Mercado Libre privacy standards, which are really high because they are trying to achieve the highest standards. So in a way, the e-commerce platform promotes privacy standards, even in jurisdiction where you have low privacy standards. And please don't record that I'm not judging Chilean privacy standards. I'm sure they are really strong. It was just an example. So we'll take more questions from the audience. No one wants to intervene, make a comment, to ask questions orally. We can turn on your mic. So please let us know in the chat box. In the meantime, I'll ask the speakers if you have questions to ask between each other based on the presentations that you have heard from the others.
I think, Ian, there's also one interesting point, a follow-up question in Q&A, which refers to what you were just saying, and it's about balancing. How do you balance these different views and concepts? It's a question from Imran. How do you? There are different views of the concepts of trust and accountabilities and different approaches. So some societies don't mind having the data being shared because that's their culture. So by focusing so much on data privacy in the context of globalization of data privacy, how do you balance those different approaches?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Do we have more questions from the speakers themselves?
We have a question for Jade from Jacques, who asks, would you argue that encrypted data should be considered as similar to goods, content type of respecting data should then be irrelevant?
So I think that what kind of data it is important in this pre-assessment process, pre-transfer assessment process. Because if it's personal data that you're transferring, you should have been, I think at this point, regardless of the framework, you should be thinking through the risk that's associated with the data transfer. So certain protections would be applied to the data, which you probably should have already thought about before it's encrypted. If you're encrypting it, that's not necessarily going to mean, you're going to do a better job if it's high risk data, because you should be doing a good job regardless, and making sure that that's implemented correctly. But I think if it is high risk data, there are other governance controls in terms of access controls and access to the key controls that where there is a heightened requirement depending on the type of data. If you're talking about it in terms of a trade angle, I think it's interesting, and I don't necessarily know this is a solid answer, but I was interested in a point that Bertrand made earlier in the Q&A about data localization applied to non-personal data, because there was a leaked version of a potential European Commission recommendation, or rather a new proposal on data governance, and it mentioned localization of data, including potentially non-personal data. And a lot of people said that that potentially violated WTO rules. So in your question about what kind of data it is, the content type should be irrelevant, I wonder in that case, how do you apply a privacy exception under WTO rules if the data is encrypted and you don't actually know if you're dealing with personal or non-personal data on the technical level? So that's sort of, I think, maybe a slightly wonky trade point, but it was something that I thought of in the context of that question. In short, I don't know for sure, but it does seem like the content type, once it's in transit, isn't as important and maybe could be considered goods. I don't know.
Thanks, Jade. Alexandra? Alexandra? Can you turn on the microphone of Bertrand Lachapelle, who is an attendee, please?
Okay, but you can do this also.
Oh, yes, because I'm opposed. That's true. Okay. So in the meantime, Richard and then Sean, I think you want to address Imran questions on the cultural dimensions or differences in terms of privacy.
Turn my microphone on. Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, I would just echo that point that I made previously, that I think choice is the important thing. So, so I think it's a good point, and definitely one that we recognise, that different cultures and different countries will have different approaches to privacy. They're coming at things from a different historical background, a different and a different optic that they see these issues through. So in to take Europe as an example, it's very much from a post-war human rights background that data protection law comes from, and so there's much more sensitivity to those issues than there are perhaps in some other countries. I think the point is that if you have a service and that is operating in different countries, if you give users the choice over what data is shared and what and how much, the more control you can give to the individual over how much they share, the better that is. And if an individual is somebody who is happy for that information to be shared, who is happy to make the trade-off, if you like, between the service that they receive and a more personalised service, for example, because they're happy to share more of their activity data, as opposed to somebody who would rather have a less personalised service, but they can keep their privacy. Then by having those controls built in, by having privacy dashboards and things like that, that's I think a good way of addressing that. So I think by giving the individual the choice of how much they share and how their data is used, and by clearly explaining to them what that means so that they can make an informed choice, that's a good way of tackling those differences between different cultures.
That's a nice answer. Sean?
And you've said 90% of what I wanted to say, so that was perfect. But just adding that from that individual choice perspective, I think the array of technologies we have at our disposal that are already being deployed will allow for that level of personalized privacy. And of course, countries or in the United States, California has a different level of privacy settings now than the rest of the states, based on some laws that were just passed. But I think we'll get that even smaller, down to the individual level, be able to set your privacy settings and even be able to change your privacy settings. I may be going through some sort of health problem where all of a sudden I want more privacy than I wanted yesterday. And I should be able to readjust those privacy settings as I choose. And so that each individual is empowered to do that. And each individual is empowered to do it as they choose, when they choose. And so it becomes more of a personalized choice than a governmental choice.
Over to you, Bertrand.
Yeah, thank you very much, and congrats for the good panel. I want to pick and thank Jade for having picked on my question, because there's a lot of debate at the moment around the notion of digital sovereignty, data sovereignty. It's becoming a buzzword in the international environment. And as she mentioned, the European Union, including Commissioner Breton, is using expressions such as European data must be stored and processed in Europe. And there doesn't seem to be a particular distinction between personal data or privacy protection and other types of data, industrial data, IoT, or whatever. And I think it's a very important element to take into account in the discussion, because we address most of the debates about data localization in terms of personal data, where it might make sense in a certain number of cases under certain conditions, particularly for health and so on. But when we're talking about industrial data, it's not necessarily the case. And I appreciated very much in the presentation about health data, the notion of the paradigm shift in value creation, because the location of the data is now less and less relevant. What matters is protections, access, control, and value creation. And the fact that you do not have to share the data. There are APIs, there are ways to access the data under certain circumstances, especially if it's non-personal data, that changes completely the economics of the data environment. And I think, to finish, that one of the challenges is that a lot of the thinking about this concept of data sovereignty is completely anchored on territoriality still. And second, that when it is dealt with in the concept of trade, it's all about moving big chunks of data as if it were traditional goods that are rival, instead of having the capacity to access or query a database across borders. This is a completely different type of question. So I just wanted to broaden the scope a little bit, because we have a mental framework that is sometimes anchored in very traditional notions of sovereignty, territoriality, and moving the data as big blocks from one country to the other, whereas it's most of the case not the challenge. But thank you very much. It's a very interesting panel.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, for this really useful insights. Who wants to react on that? Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, to the extent that we're talking about health, I think that shift in mental framework is important. I also think it takes a while to get that shift into not only the legislation, but into the legislative interpretation. You know, in the past, and you know, the internet past is relatively brief in the legislative past, and yet it is still the case that we are you know, arming our legislators with only you know, sledgehammers and buzzsaws, and they don't have the fine surgical precision or understanding. So when they talk about, well, all European data must be housed in Europe and all processing must be housed, that needs to be dissected, not only in the types of data, but in the types of processing and what you're even defining processing. And I think it takes a lot of communication and education, both informing those legislators what tools are at their disposal and what is available, as well as the public, so that they know and understand that you know, you don't need to use the tools that you use to build a house in order to do the sort of the surgery that is necessary in the current environment with data. And I think that mental framework shift has to happen on a lot of levels, and education is key.
Lee, do we have more questions in chat box or in YouTube?
No, nothing on YouTube.
Okay. Agatha, in the Q&A?
Well, there is a very related question to what is just being discussed from Jacques, that in a long-term perspective, looking at data flow in general, will there be a distinction between personal data protected specifically by privacy law and other data subject to all types of other regulation and national intrusion?
Okay. I think I will stop there, unless the speakers would like to add a last point. We will make sure to provide the slides to the IGF Secretariat, so that will be uploaded on the IGF website. So I turn now to the speakers to know if you would like to have a last point before we close the meeting.
I'll just make one point on the non-personal data point, that in the context of COVID-19, when mobile operator aggregated and anonymized, so non-personal mobile data was used for some research to see the spread of COVID and to plan possible spread, that we emphasize that even though we're talking about non-personal data, accountability is still important. So I think that's one way to think about it, that it's not necessarily in a way running to figure out which framework has to apply. I think in general that data still needs to be accountable, that the parties who are involved in those transactions need to be accountable. There needs to be some sort of governance between the parties. So that was just an important thing for us to emphasize in some of the privacy guidelines that we did, even though it wasn't technically a personal data issue.
All right. Richard?
Hi, sorry. Yeah, there were just 2 points I was going to make. The first one was just on the localization point that we were talking about, which is that I think one of the interesting points I've heard in other conversations about localization is looking at what are the incentives for data localization. So why is it that people want to start making data more localized and more, having to be kept in a specific territory? And I think it's a good thing to think about is kind of, well, what are the ways of removing the incentives for people to localize data? So if it is a worry over access, law enforcement access to data, does more common principles, more standards in terms of agreed approaches to how you access, how law enforcement and how national security data can be accessed, is that a way of then removing that desire for data localization? I think that's certainly if it comes from a fear that you don't trust what's going to happen with the data elsewhere. So it goes back to that point of trust, that the more trust there is between different countries in how data is used and what the standards are that everyone is complying with, the less incentive there is for that data localization. Of course, there will be countries who take as we talked about, a data sovereignty approach, which is kind of, we feel that we should get the benefit of our citizens' data, or our citizens should get the benefit of their own data. But yeah, I think there's an interesting question, an interesting conversation there, which is probably too broad for this webinar today, about not just kind of how do we stop data localization, but why do people want to do it in the first place? And as has also been pointed out, that I don't think it's just a case of it's a good or a bad thing. It depends on the context. It depends what the data is. There are some types of localization that are perfectly reasonable, and that others that, from a trade perspective, we would probably see as a unnecessary barrier, certainly in the UK. But again, different countries have different approaches. So I think, from a data protection perspective, we don't think data localization is always a good thing for privacy. It depends on the circumstances, it depends on the approach, but it just potentially, a mandatory data localization requirement could potentially mean that you're not able to access certain solutions that might work better for you as an organization from a privacy perspective. And then just on that point about the separation of personal data and non-personal data, I think as things stand at the moment, with data protection law coming from a human rights privacy protection angle, I think it's right that they are separated, because I think the issues that you're dealing with when looking at the protection of individuals' data and data that would affect their privacy is different from issues such as intellectual property or other things like that. So I think it is correct to maintain that distinction, although I think there are ways of anonymizing data that can allow it to be used in such a way that the privacy impact is much lower, and you can still get the benefit from the processing that you intend to do.
Great. Carl, I see you turn on your mic. Maybe you want to have the last words. I know we are running late, but go on if you have words.
Just very briefly, no, I think it's quite problematic to have too broad sweeping requirements on data localization. I think it's, as we discussed today, for example, with Sean's presentation on healthcare data, that's classically a case where we would want to have certain data localization requirements, but these broad strokes measures are likely to, what you're doing is effectively is that you're skipping the idea of having an internet where you can have transnational data flows and taking advantage of that. So that seems inadvisable. But it's also a point, I think, to, if you looked at Sean's presentation, that yes, we're sort of a different part of the economy where the value of the data lies in the sort of process data where analytics have been applied. And that might be feasible in a sector like that where the economics play out, and you can have a federated learning system where you have processing in different countries together sort of producing those analytics, but it might not be applicable for other categories of data where the investments of having those processing facilities to participate in that federated learning might not be there, right? So it might be possible for certain classes of data, and in a way that healthcare scenario describes what is necessitated by certain data localization requirements. And those necessities are something that I think we can all agree for certain classes of data, but when you have these sort of indiscriminate, broad sweeping requirements on any data, then you start losing the benefits of having interconnectivity.
Thank you. All right, on that, thank you all of you speakers and the attendees and the organizers, and as well as the IGF Secretariat for your incredible technical assistance. So on that, have a nice evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.